Hi guys, we're gonna explore different questions on counter in React. Let's get started. So let's see simple questions. So let's have a counter that we store it in const count and set count, and so we have a counter and and we want to increment it, and it will be our increment function, and we want to decrement it, and now we want to have some to display this counter so counter just to print and display it here as count. Okay, so now we have counter that started with 0, and now we can have buttons that we increment and we decrement the counter. So let's go ahead and try to increment it. So we increment it and we decrement it, and it looks like it worked. And let's say we want another button of increment twice. Okay, and we have function of increment twice, and I'm gonna ahead and create a function of increment twice here. Yeah, but I'm not gonna use count plus 2, I'm gonna use twice increments, so it should be good. I'm incrementing once and another time, so I incremented it twice. Okay, so what's gonna happen when I increment it twice? Oh, it's only incrementing once. Let's make it a bit bigger, so I call it h1 so we cannot see the counter. Yeah, just like so. Okay, so let's refresh it and say, okay, I'm incrementing twice, but it's only incrementing once. Why is that happening? So why is that happening? So let's see to this function. How does React work? So just to show it more clear, I will just replace 2 of this function with increment, because this is what it is. So what's happening in React in this function, it registers the actions it needs to set. So it looks at counter. What is counter? Counter is, let's start with 0. Counter is 0 plus 1. So I need to set counter to 1. And the second action, I need to set counter still is 0. Okay, it's still 0 because none of it is applied. It just registering the action. So now it's still 0 plus 1. So at the end of this function, it just set count to 1 twice. This is what is happening. So how can we prevent this from happening? We can use a function in set count. So we can leave this increment, and we can just use function of count. It receives previous value and set to the new value. If it's maybe confusing with the count, I can say it receives C and set C plus 1. So in this case, what is happening is it will register let's take it here again. So it will register first time, okay, previous value is what? 0 plus 1, I'm setting to 1, and the next one, it checks the previous value, so it needs to take the previous value. So if this action finished, then the value will be 1. But this function will take, okay, what is the previous value? It's 1, and then it's add 1 to it. So in this case, Yes, in this case, if I increment twice, I will get 2 and then 4. So, and in this case also, we are not, there is no dependency because it receives a function. It's not dependent on count like here. Here I'm dependent on count, and every time count is changing, this function will be created again. Okay. We need to update this function anyway because of we don't use callbacks, so they will be created on every re-render. But if I would use here, for example, use callback function, then in this case I will have no dependencies. Okay, I have no dependencies because set count is not changing, and I don't have no dependencies. But what's gonna happen on decrement if I use callback? So if I use callback, and in this case my dependency array won't be empty. Why? Because I'm dependent on count, so I will have to add count here. So anyway, this is a good way to use state, is always to take previous state and then change it, unless you have some dynamic calculation of the state. But if we're talking about a new state is dependent on previous state, it's always a good idea to do that. So what we check is we can increment and we can decrement and we can increment twice, so all of it is work. Okay, what other questions can we ask about count? So there is a question. Okay, can you make a counter that increment itself every millisecond? And you say, yeah, I can. So let's do that. I'm just gonna close that, and so it will not confuse us. Okay, so for that we want to use a use effect, and in this use effects we're gonna do a set interval, because we want to increment counter every millisecond. So we have interval, set interval every millisecond, and but what we need to do is we need to also, when the component is on mounts, I need to do clear interval, and I'm gonna do this only on mount. So our counter is running, and we can see it's increasing, and that's good. So but let's see what happens if we, in this case, we use the functions that dependent on previous value, right? But let's see if we didn't use it. Okay, if we didn't use the function, so what it means is that count plus 1. So what's gonna happen in this case? In this case, incremented only once, and then I'm not dependent on a counter, so it doesn't work. So in this case we need to put a dependency array, counter in our dependency array, and then it works. But what is happening is that every time the count changes, so every millisecond, we're setting new interval and clearing new interval. As much as well we could use just set timeout in this case, but we don't want to set interval and clear interval every time the count changes. So it's a good idea to use a function here. In the case we're using a function, then the set interval and clear in set only once, and then on unmount, but we're not unmounting right now, but it happens only once. So there is another question of this sort that can be asked you about. Okay, can you do that so you will have only one set interval, but you have to use count? You have to you cannot use a function in set count. It's a real question that can be asked and was asked. I just don't remember which place, but this question can be asked. So okay, so I want to set count, but I don't want to do a set interval every time the count changes, so I cannot put count in the dependency. So what can I do? Well, I can store count in a value in a using useRef const. So I'll say pref count. We're gonna create pref count that receives count, okay, and then in this case, so what we do is we just, instead of using count here, we're using pref count current, because this is pref current plus 1, and after we do it, we also update our pref count to be increased to the new value, okay, as much as like maybe it's a bit ugly, but you can also do so it will be more clear. Const new count is equal to this, and then we say this gets new count, and my current count equals new count. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh it, and what's happening? Our counter is working with set interval only once, and we didn't use a function passing to the use state hook that we created. Okay, so this is how we solve it, and also you can obviously do that. Another way to do it is not to store the value, but if you asked if there is other way to do it, so another way to do it is, if you asked, do you know the other way, so you say yes, you still can use ref, but you're using ref as a reference to the component. So for example, const count ref, and I'm not setting count in this case, just setting null. Why? Because my count ref, it will be the reference to my count. So I put ref here, and there is my count. As much as well, I don't have to read the count. I can just put 0 here. Okay, so it starts with 0, and then on every interval I'm not using also pref current, so we can see that. And what we can do is we can do our count ref current text content, but I'm not using count, as you remember, so I cannot use count here, but I'm taking the text content, I'm converting it to the number, and I'm adding 1 to it. Okay, so I'm directly interacting with the DOM here, so we can see our counter is running, yes, and we're setting only one interval. And if we want to check the amount of renderings, so we can just add use effect that just tells us about mounts and unmounts, and we don't pass I'm not passing anything here, and I just want to console log use effect, and on return I want to say clean up and close it. Yeah, so use effect render and clean up. Just clean up. Yeah, okay. So what's happening? We have only one render, so it's not re-rendering. Why? Because we directly using the DOM element. I'm not using count at all, so I can even close it and everything works. My counter working and everything is working. So but it's questions that you need to know that it is possible. Is it useful? Sometimes there are some cases, but you need to be aware some applications are very complex and you need to be aware of all the possible things you can do. Okay, so let's go back to the to React counter, and so I'm gonna use count here again, count, and we're gonna check the renders in this case. If I use count here, and not gonna use this, I'm gonna use set count, but not this, but just count +1. Okay, and we want to see the rendering, so we can see here that every time if it's dependent on count, it re-renders as we saw, and also I have set intervals that happening all the time. So in case we don't want it, and so we use our function c +1, and I'm gonna remove the dependency array. So let's see rendering in this case. Okay, so we have one time set interval, which is good, but we still have re-renders. Why is it happening? Because of our state, the count is changing and we want to display it. So different than what we had when we used ref, it was not re-rendering, but you just need to know that different cases can be in which cases it can be used, but also you need to know to know all the possibilities, which is good. Okay, so what other questions can we ask about the counter? We can ask, okay, now I have this counter and I want to pause and then resume the counter. Okay, so we can do that too. So for that we need something to interact with, to tell the user the ability to pause and resume. So create a button and we call it on pause, and let's go ahead and create the pause button. Well, it doesn't pause, but we want to know when to pause and when to resume, right? So we need a state for that. So for that we're gonna create a state, const pause, set pause, and in the beginning it's false because we're not pausing anything. So what's gonna happen in my function on pause, I want to set pause to, I can do not pause, but we learned that we can do it with a function. So previous value of the pause to not previous value. Okay, so it's a boolean value. And now also I can also say, okay, if pause is true, if it's true then resume, and if it's false then pause. Okay, pause is not defined. Maybe just to refresh it. Okay, so let's just also close these logs because they might confuse you, and refresh that. Okay, so We have a button pause. It's obviously does nothing because we didn't added it to our counting interval. So we're gonna add it to our use effect, obviously. So I'm gonna create the interval. I'm gonna put let interval. It's gonna be start, and then I'm gonna do that. So I want to do interval only if it is not paused. Not paused. If I'm not paused, I want to start my interval. Okay. And I'm dependent on pause. Obviously, this property, I'm dependent on pause. So what's happening? I set interval, it's counting. I do pause, I stopped. I see I had a clear interval. Well, and set interval here does nothing. Well, we see the printing, but it should be inside because it didn't start it again. So the print is confusing. Let's start again. So I have a counter that is counting. I do pause. I had clear interval, and then when I hit resume, I have clear interval and then set interval again. So this is exactly what we want. We want it to stop and then resume from the same number. Yes, resume, and it counting again. Well, that's all the possible questions I know about counter, and have a great day.